All right. So while folks in the audience are thinking of questions, I'll just start us off with just one question for the panel. What do you see as the key roadblocks to delivering on causal inference for your advertising clients? Ying?
I can start. Test. Okay. So I guess for this we need to differentiate two different scenarios. One is whether we're doing. So of course I'm going to talk about the randomized experiments and what I think is difficult to run. When do I think it's difficult to run randomized experiments, right? So I guess the first thing we need to differentiate is two scenarios. One is we're running this just for one ad platform. This is essentially what we do at Google because we're only measuring for YouTube, right? But on the other hand, if you're running, you want to measure across ad platforms, then it actually is very difficult to build a real randomized control group, right? So if you're trying to measure different ad platforms, I think that's essentially the first challenge, right? Then we need to differentiate the situations where you are talking about e-commerce types of platforms, or in terms of the outcome metrics, I guess some of you are talking about sales lift, right? So when you're having sort of not e-commerce types of outcomes, then there is another complication layer, which, for example, then sometimes when we're working with third-party measurement agencies, we need to share our ad impression data with them, and then we need to figure out a way to do this in a privacy safe manner to share ad impression data with them. And sometimes the matching rate is actually a challenge as well, right? So because we need to make sure that we have enough users that's on our ad platforms as well as in the agency's data or panels, right? So then that way they will have enough data to begin with. I guess that's essentially the two challenges on running randomized experiments.
Yep. So the challenge of running it across a media plan, all the different platforms on a media plan, and then the challenge of sharing data between platforms while respecting privacy.
Exactly.
Yep. Vijoy? Thanks.
So I divide into two things. It's about when you talk about lift, right? There are two components to it. There's a media component to it. There's a purchase behavior component to it. And there is asymmetric data signals. If you look at purchase data, it's fairly democratic. Retailers and others provide enough data, so there's enough strong signals coming from that side. On the media side, that's sort of what Ying touched upon as well. Different platforms and how they share data is not always baselined, and not all of them share. So to that extent, I think that causes a little bit of friction in what you measure. Is how I'd put
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah, Joy?
So one of the biggest challenges for me is from a randomized experience perspective, or pretty much any measurement, is validation. So you present these results, and then you make some decisions off of that, and then you move on to the next thing. And the cadence, the rapid speed with which we are kind of turning these results around is putting very little focus on validation, and it's something that I don't think either I or anybody really touched upon. And it's really challenging in kind of causal and inferential world to actually do any validation, but and that's something that a lot of our clients are asking. So this is great, these results are great, but if I make these changes, what am I going to see? And then we say, yeah, you're going to see this, and these are the lifts that we are seeing, and then we move on to the next thing.
Yep. Yeah, let's have questions. Take a question back there. Gentleman in the red.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really curious about whether your sophisticated audience-based stratification methods and RCTs are complementary or not with more geographic-based holdout strategies for doing experiments, where you see them together or where you separate those.
So probably start with Vijoy. Do you want to just briefly define the stratification that you're referring to? Is this stratification of propensity to be exposed to the ad, or stratification, you talked about stratification and randomization going together, just sort of define it.
Sure, absolutely. So there are two things that go into it, right? One is the outcome variable itself that you're measuring. For example, if purchase is what we're talking about, then that's the effect. Or if in medication cure, right? So those are the outcome variables you stratify on. Like divide the world into, for example, in the ad world into heavy buyers, light buyers, so they're proportionate to the population. That's one way to do it, outcome variables. The other is what we generally do, right? Something that is correlated with the outcome variable, for example, demographics, geography, and such. I wish we had all the data in the world, census data. That's not possible. So where possible, what you do is to build on both. Where you have outcome variable, you do that exercise, and on top of it, you add a bells and suspenders type strategy, which is you pretty much have demographic and geographic variables across the US. And for that particular campaign, let's say the campaign is a local campaign, you would want to stratify within that world. If it's national, you do, but you do it both on the correlated variables as well as the purchase-based variables. That's how I would, just because we don't have census data out there.
Yep. Thanks, Vijoy. Any other questions? Yep. So Chris.
Can you speak a little bit on the relationship between pre-testing ads and the actual sales lift outcome that you see? Have you seen a shift in the relationship between pre-tested ads and actual sales lift over the last few years?
You're talking about creative testing?
Yes.
Yeah. So you want to have a point of view on that? Joy?
Jump in here. So it's a challenge, right? So normally it's like probably a 50-50 chance that what results you see in pre-testing actually kind of pans out in market. And obviously a lot of that has to do with kind of pre-testing being absent some of the realities of actual in-market execution, kind of the reach that you're driving for, and there's a certain target market you're going after. In reality, with the reach goals and the budgets, you might actually either under or overshoot that and go outside of kind of who the target was. So the in-market conditions impacts kind of a lot of kind of the pre-testing results actually showing up. But a lot of it can be adjusted, so especially with things like dynamic creative, some of the realities of the market that, or the context within which the audience is consuming it, that are a little bit out of your control, can be adjusted on the fly. And we've seen kind of the ability to kind of putting in programmatic creative or dynamic creative and using closed loop kind of results with kind of obviously due respect to the attribution scamming point that you had mentioned, a new term that I learned today. But what we've been doing is kind of creating real-time feedback loops from kind of things like attribution measurement and brand lift measurement to push it back to kind of adjust assumptions around creative. So I think a little flexibility there allows you to kind of get the lifts that the pre-testing would suggest. But there is a sizable delta between pre-testing results and in-market results.
Have you seen it change over time, though?
Have I seen it change, meaning?
Yeah, have you seen that delta getting wider or smaller?
Actually, right now, with what we do, with kind of or what the industry is headed towards with dynamic creative and kind of using kind of real-time feedback back into, we are actually seeing the delta decrease a little bit. But otherwise, sans kind of all of that intervention, you'll actually see the delta widen because kind of the context within which the audience is consuming is actually getting fragmented a lot more channels opening up. So there are a lot of intervening conditions that the pre-testing cannot account for. So absent kind of real-time feedback, closed loop optimization, you're actually going to see that delta widen.
Yeah, when we talk about incrementality, we're usually talking about media, but it's just as needed in creative. There's a widespread standard practice of running creative through a correlation-based attribution model every month, looking at the relative coefficients for different creatives and setting your weights for your creative rotation in your ad server based on that, which generally what you're going to find is that it's the promotional creative, the free, low price, is going to be more correlated with a near-term action, right? And so without looking at lift, you're inadvertently undermining your brand equity. So it's not just in media, it's in creative as well, where we really need to change the incentive structure by figuring out these incrementality challenges. And maybe time for one more question before we go to the next panel. Yep.
Hi, this question will be particularly for Ying. So I'm wondering how, if, the experimental framework could be used to compare different Google products, such as similar audiences and custom audiences. I'm, particularly underlining custom audiences because it's a dynamic audience, and definitely, some sort of cross-contamination control needs to be applied that, a control group hasn't, been exposed to the test or vice versa. And how is this handled at Google?
Yes, that's a very good question, right? So as you said, at Google we not only provide demo targeting, we also provide target based on affinity or even custom affinity groups, right? We in brand lift we do provide functionalities to provide a lift estimate for your targeting groups. I don't quite understand your question on the part that the contamination issue, but
custom affinity is dynamic, right? I mean, you can become a member and out.
Yeah. So essentially, yes, you're right. So the label is dynamic, but everything like the randomization step we do is at the campaign time, at the auction time, right? So every time. So first, we need to make sure that at the campaign time you are within the targeting of a custom affinity group. So that's the sort of a pre-qualification. And the randomization is actually happening at the auction time, right? So we're making sure that at the auction time, that user belongs to the custom affinity group you're targeting. Does that answer your question?
To some extent, okay. So you
Okay.
are doing randomization on the user times time space, not just by users.
Right, exactly. So we're doing the randomization for each user at the auction time. We're not pre-randomize the users.
Yeah, Ying, maybe just a quick follow-up to that is you talked about how on YouTube you do these brand lift studies at scale. And do you ever run into issues with, are you doing any balancing? This is a common thing that comes up with RCTs is in advertising, you still need to do balancing between the test and control, and then balancing is best done based on applying, human expertise on what was the targeting for a campaign. So it has to kind of be done study by study. Do you ever run into issues around not really being able to do that type of balancing when the entire thing is automated at scale?
Actually, we don't do any manual balancing, right? So all the balancing we do is controlled by the targeting criteria, right?
Yeah.
So we just make sure that all the users are meet your targeting criteria. And then we just have a very high quality randomization step at the auction time.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Excellent panel, excellent presentations. Really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to Paul for the next excellent set of panelists.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. So